have a relatively younger or young audience now. So I think this is essential. Why? Because we think this is an opportune time to take a look, no, again, what happened in history 20 years ago. Ilang taon pa lang kayo. Hindi kasi yung di pa pinapangalan. Okay? So, most of you. So, to have her welcome remarks, let's have Dr. Evalyn G of the Third World Studies Center.
Congressman Erin Tañada, Attorney Evalyn Ursua, Professor Tadem, Attorney Virginia Suarez-Fidla, Miss Yuen Abana, former Quezon City Vice Mayor Charito Planas, Professor Ronald Monmisa, colleagues in academe, friends from civil society, students, ladies and gentlemen, magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. On behalf of the three organizations co-organizing this event, the UP Department of Political Science, chaired by Professor Ruth Rico, the Scrap VFA Movement, headed by Ms. Ana Maria Numenso, and the UP Third World Studies Center, I welcome you to the forum entitled Partnership or Subservience, Reassessing Philippine-U.S. Military Relations. This is not the first time that we attempted to hold a forum on the Visiting Forces Agreement. A few months back, we tried to bring together representatives from civil society, academe, the legislature, and the executive branch to come to a forum to discuss the review of the Visiting Forces Agreement. Sadly, that first attempt failed to bring the invited guests together, but this time we also did our best to invite representatives from the executive branch, particularly the BFA Commission and the American Desk of the Department of Foreign Affairs to the forum, but these people declined. However, we managed to bring a good group representing the legislature, academe, and civil society. So we have today's forum, and we thank our panelists for accepting our invitation. The timing of this forum is also not accidental. This forum is a lead-up to commemorating September 16, 1991. Marami sa mga bata na nandito ngayon ay hindi pa pinapanganak. So, what is the significance of September 16, 1991? 20 years ago, the Philippine Senate voted to end the United States military bases presence in the country. It was a historic moment for the country as the Philippine Senate, traditionally labeled as pro-U.S., promoting U.S. interests, voted in favor of national sovereignty. I clearly remember that event 20 years ago. I was a senior undergraduate political science student at that time. I was with my organization, the UP Samahan sa Aghampang Politika, or UP SAPUL, and our organization was part of the big contingent of a multi-sectoral UP group that marched to the Senate on that rainy day of September 16, 1991. We joined the large group urging the Senate to vote no to the treaty extending the stay of the U.S. bases. We were pitted against a pro-treaty group mobilized by no less than President Corazon Aquino. We also celebrated when all the senators cast their votes and Senate President Topito Salonga declared that the new treaty was not ratified. I hope students of this generation will know that the significance of that particular event in our history. Since 1991, the VFA, or the Visiting Forces Agreement, replaced the U.S. bases as one of the symbols of Philippine-U.S. relations. It has existed since 1998, and we have sufficient time now to review how this later agreement has affected issues of national sovereignty and security, as well as the lives of our people. After a series of public hearings on the BFA, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations in the previous Congress came out with its report. And its chair, Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago, authored Senate Resolution number 1356 calling for the review of the BFA, which was approved by the Senate in 2009. Resolutions which demanded for the termination of the BFA were also filed in the current Congress by Senator Santiago in the Senate. This is Senate Resolution number 3, and by Representative Erin Tañada in the House of Representatives. This is resolution number 17. The response of the current administration in the later part of 2010 was to initiate a review of the VFA to be headed by Executive Secretary Paquito Ochoa, justifying that termination may be too radical. Nothing has been heard of the status or results of that review. High-ranking U.S. political and military officials have also come and gone, during which the VFA must have been taken up, yet the administration of President Noynoy Aquino continues to be silent about this matter. So it is important today to talk about the Visiting Forces Agreement, as well as efforts on the part of the legislature and civil society groups to review the VFA and to give recommendations to our government. I look forward to a very interesting forum. Salamat po at magandang umaga.
Maraming salamat sa Chensa. To introduce our speakers, the first one, kilala ng marami, young looking din. Lorenzo Erin Tañada III currently represents the 4th District of Quezon in the 15th Congress and is one of the Deputy Speakers of the House. During the last 2 terms, he has served as a member of the House. He was Assistant Majority Floor Leader and Chairperson of the House Committee on Human Rights. He has also proved himself a champion of the protection of human rights in the Philippines, having authored important legislations penalizing torture and other crimes against human rights. Earlier this year, Representative Tañada filed House Joint Resolution number 17, which called for the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines, following previous calls from the Senate to review the VFA. Our second speaker is currently a professional lecturer of the College of Law, UP-Diliman, a human rights feminist lawyer, Attorney Evalyn Ursua. She has worked as the lead private prosecutor, if you know that case, the Nicole rape case. She has seen strongly supported initiatives to scrap the Visiting Forces Agreement. After our speakers, we will have our reactors from Asian Center, University of the Philippines-Diliman, Professor Eduardo C. Tadem, and then the campaign officer of Partido ng Manggagawa, UN Abana. And then later on, we will hear from Virginia Suarez-Pinla, the spokesperson of the Scrap VFA Movement. And then, to do the closing remarks, we will have Professor Emeritus and former chair of the department, President of the University of the Philippines, Francisco Nemenso Jr. That's it.
Maraming salamat, Ronald. Before I proceed, 20 years ago, sinimulan na ni Dr. Chensa, I was preparing for the bar exams. But since si Tatay was heavily involved in defending the resolution to terminate the U.S. military bases treaty, eh di, syempre, yung review ko haphazard, no, sa bar review. And as a matter of fact, when the day of the voting came, I think that was the 3rd week of the bar exams, commercial law ang susunod na topic. Eh, sabi ko, mas importante yung boto na mangyayari sa Senado. Kaya I excused myself from the review and proceeded to the Senate and stayed there from the morning till all the way till the afternoon and evening. It was a rainy day that day, and I'm sure everybody knows about that. Another aside to those students who are here, who may have been just born 1991 onwards, if you want to at least be part of history, we cannot say that you'd be fed, but there's going to be an event on Friday, September 16, at the Club Filipino. We are trying to get as much of the 12 senators who voted against the treaty to be present at the activity. We are hoping that Senator Salonga will be feeling well because he's I think, if I'm not mistaken, 90 and above. And he has his good days and he has his bad days. So we're hoping that he'd be well and he'd be able to attend the forum. So, with that, let me start. On the 16th of September 1991, then Senator Roberto Tañada, ang aking tatay, said in his sponsorship speech to Senate Resolution number 1259, which sought the non-concurrence to the proposed basis treaty, and I quote, "A historic and economic opportunity awaits the Philippines as the Filipino people, reinforced by the mandate of the Constitution, now seek to remove the last most visible vestiges of colonialism in this country, the U.S. military bases. Upon the powers vested in us by the will of our people through the Constitution, let us be a beacon of the long-shackled hopes of our martyrs and nation." Close quote. 20 years have passed after 12 senators courageously voted down the presence of U.S. bases in our country. 20 years have passed after this momentous victory was attained by and for the Filipino people against elements that only sought to trample upon our sovereignty as a nation. Now is the time to look back at the moment of history, for it is necessary for us to be reminded of the triumphs of the past in order to win over the struggles of the present. The fight against the U.S. military bases in our country was a fight against colonialism and military occupation by a foreign entity. Starting from 1565 with Spain, Filipinos fought gallantly. We ended this fight in 1991 by expelling American bases from Philippine soil. That was more than 400 years of struggle for freedom from military might of foreigners. However, that fight is far from over. Present circumstances show us that amid the great success of the Senate in 1991, we're still at the mercy of the U.S. due to the Visiting Forces Agreement. On the other hand, the arduous battle against the bases is a shining example of how we should continue the call and respond to the challenge today. For the benefit of those who were still infants or even not born at the time, like the students of political science and other disciplines that are here today, let me recall the events that transpired in September of 1991. The Senate, 20 years ago, conducted marathon public hearings for 5 days with the Philippine negotiating panel, representatives from the executive, military leaders, academic experts of defense, and civil society. Afterwards, for 3 days, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations tackled the treaty before the 5-day plenary debates. These were done in the midst of former President Corazon Aquino lobbying and rallying against the cause of the 12 senators who supported the removal of the bases. Against all odds, how did the victory come about? Professor Roland Simbulan, who was then a senior political consultant to former Senator Roberto Tañada, had this as a clear response to this worry. He said that martial law declared by Marcos in 1972 displayed how the U.S. became the antithesis of democracy they supposedly taught us by, being the main supporter of this atrocious curtailment of our liberties by the dictatorship. Simbulan said that, and I quote, "If it were a choice between U.S. strategic interests such as nuclear bases versus human rights and democracy in the Philippines, the U.S. showed it would not hesitate to choose the former. Martial law under Marcos made this perfectly clear." Here we see interrelationships among players and elements in Philippine politics. But more importantly, using another lens, we see how nationalism is an inherent ingredient to the institutional memory of the collective. The Filipino people fought alongside our valiant senators back then. Plenary debates ensued from morning till evening of the 16th of September 1991. The length of the battle cannot be measured only that one fateful day. Senator Roberto Tañada took up the cudgels of the struggle against foreign encroachment of our sovereignty that was led by his own father, my lolo, Senator Lorenzo, Tañada, long before the 1950s, with then Senator Claro M. Recto, and all other then called non-governmental organizations, political organizations, or civil society. Beyond the halls of the Senate were more than 100,000 freedom-loving Filipinos who waited patiently under heavy rains. In spite of the bullying of the U.S. back then towards the Philippine Senate, and through the critical mass of informed citizens that supported the Magnificent 12, sovereignty prevailed. Richard Armitage and the U.S. negotiating panel were unsuccessful in their bid for the approval of a treaty that only served the interests of one side. Diplomatic reciprocity was clearly absent. However, the U.S. panel was caught off guard by what transpired in the Senate. In casting his vote, then Senate President Obito Salonga said that day, and I quote, may well be the day when in this Senate found the soul, the true spirit of this nation, because we mustered the courage and the will to declare the end of foreign military presence in the Philippines. With that, we go back to the present. Despite the great victory in the past, we remain with new battles to wage and new struggles to triumph over. In our midst, we find the so-called agreement between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the government of the United States of America regarding the treatment of United States Armed Forces visiting the Philippines, which we simply know as the Visiting Forces Agreement. An unspecified period of stay of visiting forces from the United States and the failure to enumerate and explain activities that their military is allowed to engage in within our territory are major flaws of the supposed treaty. Such should not be left unnoticed or unaddressed. It should virtually be declared void for vagueness under the doctrine of constitutional law. In the past, there have been numerous calls from both the House of Representatives and the Senate, as well as from the public and private sector seeking for the review of the Visiting Forces Agreement. However, nothing at all has been done about this. In the first place, even with a review of this agreement, we will find glaring defects that have enabled many American soldiers to circumvent the laws of the land. There has been debate between whether or not combat operations are allowed through the VFA and via the Philippine Constitution. However, the VFA itself was never meant for the activities involving combat, but it hides under the pretentious cloak of simple military training. Yet we find a myriad of reports where American soldiers have engaged in direct combat operations in Mindanao. Some reports also say that they have violated the laws of our country and threatened the safety of innocent civilians. A soldier, Reggie Lane, was allegedly involved in the shooting of Buyong in Isnihal, a farmer in Tuguran, Basilan in 2002. According to eyewitness account of the massacre in Pumapoy Island, Tawi-Tawi on May 25, 2004, at least 4 American soldiers were part of the raid of joint military and police elements of the Philippines and United States. These dastardly incidents, among many others, have occurred despite having an entire article in the BFA dedicated to the respect of American troops for the laws of the Republic of the Philippines. The same article also states that, and I quote, the government of the United States shall take all measures within its authority, close quote, to guarantee the respect of our laws, ensured with their presence within our territory. Unfortunately, this is not the case at all. Lance Corporal Daniel Smith, of course, the famous rape case which was handled by Attorney Ursua, who was convicted of rape by the Makati City Regional Trial Court Branch 139 in 2006, but later acquitted by the Court of Appeals, was detained at the United States Embassy, an act deemed legal and not in accordance with the BFA by the Supreme Court in Nicolas versus Romulo. which thus shows the grave error in the Visiting Forces Agreement in terms of custody of American soldiers who violate the laws of the Philippines. Furthermore, the agreement does not give ample specifications and limits on the number of U.S. troops allowed to enter the country and the mechanisms by which they are individually identified, which violates the territorial integrity of the Philippines under the Constitution through the lack of power of the government to regulate the entry of foreign military forces. It is also important to note that there is a fundamental change of circumstance in the case of the Visiting Forces Agreement, where the United States Armed Forces have went beyond military training exercises by participating in actual combat operations of the armed forces of the Philippines against the insurgents. Article 62 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties states that, and I quote, fundamental change of circumstances which has occurred regard to those existing at the time of the conclusion of the treaty and which was not foreseen by the parties may not be invoked as a ground for terminating or withdrawing from the treaty unless the effect of the change is radically to transform the extent of obligations still to be performed under the treaty. Clearly, such an alteration in the agreement provides a basis for its termination. Moreover, previous Supreme Court declarations that the United States had recognized the VFA as a treaty is contradicted by the language of the U.S. law itself, which refers only to international agreements which are not characterized as treaties. The President of the United States, through the U.S. Secretary of State, only transmitted the VFA to the United States Senate not for its concurrence pursuant to its Constitution, but only by virtue of the Case Subloki Act of the United States. In a decision of the United States Supreme Court, it states that while an international treaty may constitute an international commitment, it is not a binding domestic law unless U.S. Congress has enacted measures implementing it or unless the treaty itself is self-executing. Based on the own laws of the United States, the VFA is not recognized and not given consent to as a treaty by the U.S. Senate, and thus should be considered invalid. The VFA, seeing that it was never acknowledged by the United States of America as a treaty, is only a simple executive agreement. The Visiting Forces Agreement is in clear violation of our Constitution and is an affront to our sovereignty as a nation. After the rejection of the U.S. bases 20 years ago, we are faced with a new challenge of rejecting another lopsided agreement where our country is at the losing end. Some would fear that the junking of the VFA would result to severe ties with the United States. However, as I said before, I am sure we can continue our history of amity, but we definitely need another way to give it expression. We can give them a hand, and we should, but I don't see why we should give them back the whole arm. It may appear that we are getting foreign help from the U.S. in handling local problems, but in reality, we are creating more issues to solve by allowing our rights as a people to be trampled upon and our sovereignty as a nation to be reduced to nothing by airing U.S. soldiers who abuse U.S. hospitality. As Tatay once said, and I quote, "What needs to be restated is that we did not put our U.S. military bases in 1991 only to invite our old masters back on our shores. We did not reclaim Subic and Clark and make them boom with business and economic activity only to turn back the clock to a shameful past of inequality and mendicancy." He also stated that there are definitely better means to resolve disputes with our foreign neighbors. China, in the case of the Spratlys, through bilateral and multilateral diplomacy and negotiation. The Visiting Forces Agreement, instead of being a tool for empowerment of our military, only tends to create a blanket of unnecessary dependence to the U.S. and our armed forces. This is why I filed House Joint Resolution number 17. It's high time that we carry on with the struggle that saw triumph 4 days from now, 20 years ago. We need to pass both joint resolutions in the House of Representatives and in the Senate to make it perfectly clear to the world that the Philippines will not stand idly by as our sovereignty of our country and the rights of our people are violated by the military might of a powerful nation. From the 12 daring senators of 1991, let us hope to see hundreds of legislators from both House of Congress taking up the reins to lead the Filipino people towards the path of nationalism. Let us learn from the victories of the past in order to overcome the struggles of the day. Maraming salamat. Mabuhay tayo lahat.
Good morning. In my work as a private prosecutor in the Subic case, I had the privilege of reading documents that were not available to the public, and even to many officials of our own government. Someone in the DFA thought that even though he could not publicly join in the protest against the DFA, he could at least leak documents that show us how the U.S. government deals with their own government in the matter of the DFA. I refer specifically to the exchange of notes between the Philippine government and the U.S. Embassy on the matter of custody of the soldiers accused of raping Nicole. This is how the exchange went. You will recall that soon after the criminal case for rape was filed against the 4 U.S. servicemen in an Olongapo City court, the judge of that court issued warrants of arrest against the 4 accused upon the motion of the prosecution asking the custody of the U.S. servicemen to be transferred to Philippine authorities. However, the Department of Justice returned the warrants of arrest to the court with a letter stating that the warrants were not served on the accused for the reasons stated in the note verbal from the U.S. Embassy. And that note verbal was dated January 16, 2006. The note verbal from the U.S. Embassy tells the Philippine government that the U.S. government shall continue to exercise custody until completion of all judicial proceedings as provided for by Article 5, Paragraph 6 of the Visiting Force Agreement. This answered a note verbal previously sent by our Department of Foreign Affairs dated November 16, 2005, requesting the transfer of custody of the accused to the Philippine authorities. To the credit of the DFA at that time, it answered the U.S. note verbal, reiterating the position of the Philippine government in its earlier note verbal that that rape should be properly understood as an extraordinary case, as was the intent that governed when the Philippines agreed to the inclusion of Article 5, Paragraph 6 of the Visiting Force Agreement, and thus the custody of the 4 should be transferred to the Philippine authorities. Of course, this note verbal was ignored by the U.S. Embassy. What happened to the warrants of arrest? The judge recalled all of them upon the request of the U.S. soldiers, agreeing with them that they have effectively surrendered to the jurisdiction of the court by appearing through their lawyers and by filing motions. You will recall that after this, the accused servicemen remained in the custody of the U.S. Embassy throughout the trial of the case, thus depriving our court of an essential component of its criminal jurisdiction. You will also recall that when the trial court finally convicted one of the accused, Daniel Smith, on December 4, 2006, a physical tug-of-war occurred right before us inside the courtroom in the Makati City Hall, as the American security escorts of Smith tussled with their own police over the physical custody of Daniel Smith. This occurred immediately after the promulgation of the judgment of conviction, after the court ordered that Smith be detained in the Makati City Jail to await service of sentence pending appeal. Before the eyes of the world, the U.S. security escorts defied the court's order and tried to prevent our police from getting custody of Smith. If you were watching the news on TV at the time, you will recall seeing on TV how the U.S. security men chased our police all the way to the Makati City Jail in an attempt to gain custody of Daniel Smith. You will recall that Daniel Smith had U.S. security escorts right inside the Makati City Jail, and that he stayed for only about 3 weeks. In the dead of night before the end of December 2006, our own Philippine authorities sprung Daniel Smith from jail and brought him back to the U.S. Embassy in violation of our basic rules of criminal law and procedure. Finally, you will recall how our own Secretary of Justice and Secretary of Foreign Affairs entered into a series of agreements interpreting the VFA with the U.S. Ambassador in order to provide Daniel Smith's stay in the U.S. Embassy some semblance of legality. I am sure that those of you who are familiar with the provisions of the VFA will agree with me that the series of incidents that I have described was made possible by at least two things. Number one, the ambiguous language of the VFA, which in my opinion was deliberate, thus allowing the U.S. government to impose its own interpretation on the Philippine government about the meaning and intent of the Visiting Force Agreement. This failure of language is evident in Article 5, Paragraph 6, which spawned conflicting interpretations on both sides. Our government's own subservience, and second, of course, our government's own subservience to the dictates of the U.S. government and its own learned helplessness in resisting pressure from the U.S. government. If you will recall also, there was much talk while Daniel Smith was in the Makati City Jail about the cancellation of the Balikatan exercises and the withdrawal of economic and military aid from the U.S. government should Philippine authorities refuse to return Daniel Smith to the U.S. Embassy. My second reflection on the VFA is how our own Supreme Court has failed us in a monumental way in defending our sovereignty. In a series of challenges before the Supreme Court, starting from Bayan versus Zamora, it repeatedly upheld the validity of the VFA by turning a blind eye to the blatant violation of our own Constitution. The dissenting opinion of then Associate Justice Renato Puno in the case of Bayan is instructive on how the provisions of our Constitution should have been interpreted in accordance with the intent of its framers within the framework of national sovereignty against the distorted interpretation of the majority. In the last challenge before the Supreme Court, in the case of Nicolas versus Romulo, the court had a rare opportunity to rectify the supreme wrong that it committed against the Filipino people in the case of Bayan. But the court, in an amazing display of logic and creativity combined, found a way to continue to justify what is clearly an unconstitutional agreement. In addition, the court engaged in a gross distortion of the chronology of events in the conflict over the custody of the soldiers. One of the statements of the court in the decision reads, and I quote, "Pursuant to the Visiting Force Agreement between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States, entered into on February 10, 1998, the United States, at its request, was granted custody of defendant Daniel Smith pending proceedings." We pointed out to the Supreme Court that this is clearly wrong or an error because the U.S. never requested for custody, nor was it granted custody. It unilaterally took custody of the soldiers. Another distortion of fact in the decision of the court in Nicolas versus Romulo was that part of the decision that made it appear that Daniel Smith was first transferred to the U.S. Embassy before the matter of his custody was brought to the Court of Appeals. This is incorrect. It is on record that on December 14, 2006, Daniel Smith filed with the Court of Appeals a petition for certiorari, impugning the order of the Makati Court directing his detention in the Makati City Jail. The Department of Foreign Affairs, through the Solicitor General, subsequently intervened in this suit. But after the Court of Appeals denied the prayer of Smith for him to be transferred back to the U.S. Embassy, the Philippine government submitted agreements entered into by the U.S. Ambassador and the Secretary of Foreign Affairs on the transfer of Smith to the U.S. Embassy. When the Court of Appeals did not act on the motion of the DFA and simply noted the agreement submitted, our executive officials proceeded to take matters into their hands. About 11 o'clock in the evening, December 29, 2006, Respondent Smith was released from the Makati City Jail by Philippine officials and turned over to the U.S. authorities. We asked the Supreme Court to correct these statements that are clearly erroneous, pointing out that given that the decision will be read, scrutinized, and become a significant part of our legal and political history, it is our common obligation to our people to ensure that factual errors are not made as historical facts. But the Supreme Court ignored this. I worry that those who read the decision, especially in law schools, will accept as historical facts the court's narration of events, since they will be without access to an accurate retelling of what happened. In the last phase of our efforts in 2009 to convince the Supreme Court to declare the VFA unconstitutional, we invoked new revelations about the presence of U.S. troops in the country. You will recall that on August 21, 2009, the New York Times published an article by Tom Shanker discussing the announcement of United States Defense Secretary Robert Gates that the U.S. has decided to keep an elite 600-troop counterinsurgency operation deployed in the Philippines despite pressure to reassign its members to fulfill urgent needs elsewhere, like in Afghanistan or Iraq. The same article reported the existence of the Joint Special Operations Task Force Philippines and the fact that it is composed of highly trained units. The New York Times article also reported that the Special Operations Forces are the most highly skilled in the military at capture and kill missions against insurgents and terrorist leaders. Within the ranks, Army Special Forces, known as the Green Berets, have for decades been training allied troops on their home soil and conducting counterinsurgency missions. The same article contained an admission that the members of the JSOEFP have been operating in the Philippines for 7 years, that they were instrumental in the killing of Abu Sayyaf and MILF members or leaders, and that they also conduct civic actions in a simultaneous counterinsurgency effort. The admission by both U.S. Defense Secretary Gates and a certain Colonel Poltruck that the U.S. forces have been continuously operating in the Philippines in the last 7 years is corroborated by a former officer of the AFP. On August 27, 2009, former Navy Lieutenant Senior Grade Nancy Gadian testified before the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on the VFA, headed by Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago, that the presence of the U.S. troops in southern Mindanao has been permanent and continuous, and that they have established facilities in various parts of Zamboanga, Tawi-Tawi, and Pulo, Cebu. Her testimony is based on an affidavit she executed on August 26, 2008. The details that Ms. Gadian provides in her affidavit are based on direct and personal knowledge that she acquired when she was involved in the planning and administrative operations of the Balikatan exercises and from performing liaison work with U.S. military forces in Mindanao. She narrates that after the 2002 Balikatan exercises, the U.S. troops stayed and established a permanent and continuous presence in southern Mindanao. Based on the U.S. admissions and Ms. Gadian's affidavit, the following appears as the real picture of the presence of the U.S. troops in Mindanao. Number 1, they number about 600, mostly from the Special Operations Forces, who are considered the most highly skilled in the U.S. military at capture and kill missions against insurgent and terrorist leaders. Number 2, they have been stationed and operating in the Philippines for the past 7 years, even without any Balikatan exercises going on. Number 3, they have their own facilities consisting of permanent and temporary structures that are fenced off and generally inaccessible even to the Philippine military, and which are located in various Philippine military camps and facilities in southern Mindanao. These include a small sealed compound on Camp Navarro, Zamboanga City, which serves as a Joint Special Operations Task Force's headquarters, and other facilities in other parts of Zamboanga, Cotabato, and Ursua, which host substantial Special Operations detachments, mainly Army Green Berets and Navy SEALs, backed by support forces from all the services. Number 4, they operate throughout the sprawling southern Philippines. Number 5, they're engaged in counterinsurgency operations and were instrumental in the killing of Abu Sayyaf and MILF leaders. Number 6, part of the work is combat related. Number 7, the relatively lean number is designed for a low intensity approach which can be continued indefinitely without much public opposition or even notice, unlike in Afghanistan and Iraq. Their presence in the country draws legality from the existing Visiting Forces Agreement. Ms. Gadian has confirmed that, and I quote, the continuous presence of the U.S. troops in the Philippines has been justified to them, meaning the Philippine military, as part of the counter-terrorism measures of the United States and is framed outside of the Balikatan exercises but within the Visiting Forces Agreement. The disturbing revelations of Ms. Gadian in her affidavit that the U.S. troops freely engaged in intelligence operations in southern Mindanao, their deployment or movement is not monitored or controlled by our own government, and they're embedded in Filipino troops who are engaged in actual combat, are made possible under the vague and broad terms of the VFA, which allow U.S. troops to engage in undefined activities for an unlimited duration. The power to control the U.S. troops' entry, as well as the authority of the Philippine government, is removed. There is no categorical provision that defines the scope of the areas of Philippine territory that American troops and personnel may visit, in quotes, and the activities which the United States military and civilian personnel may undertake in the Philippines are conspicuously undefined. Evidently, without a basing agreement, the U.S. troops have established a permanent and continuous presence in the country since 2002, in violation of Article 18, Section 25 of the 1987 Constitution. The VFA, as its preamble declares, was intended to regulate the presence of U.S. soldiers visiting the Philippines to participate in government-approved activities. But since the VFA fails to specify the period of stay of the U.S. troops and what activities they can engage in, it has given legitimacy to the permanent and continuous presence of the U.S. troops in the Philippines, which is not allowed under the Constitution except under a treaty duly concurred in by our Senate and which is also recognized as a treaty by the other contracting state. That treaty must expressly authorize the permanent or continuous presence of foreign military troops and the establishment of foreign military bases or facilities, and allowing it under the vague and broad terms of the VFA, which is not even a treaty as far as the United States is concerned, circumvents the general prescription of Article 18, Section 25 of the Constitution. Given all this, let me paraphrase what we said to the Supreme Court in our appeal for the VFA to be declared unconstitutional. All these should make every decent and self-respecting Filipino weep. Our government has sold out our sovereignty. It is in tatters. In the words of Justice Puno, it is dissenting opinion in Ryan versus Amar. Thank you very much.
When Princess Lorenzo called me on the phone, asked me to be a reactor to distinguished senators, I actually wanted to refuse because this is not really my field. My field of study, Asian studies, is peasantry, rural development, agrarian social movements. So what I did was to contact a former high-ranking local government official in Zamboanga City. And I conducted a brief 30-minute interview with this person, who is now based in Manila. And my presentation will be basically the results of that interview, which I would say on the outset is quite disturbing and revealing of events and circumstances regarding the presence of U.S. troops in Zamboanga City. First thing this former official said to me was that, you know, these American troops have been in Zamboanga since 2002. They have been there ever since. How come they've never left? This official thought, and this is also the opinion of Zamboanga City officials, was that the U.S. troops were in the country only for military exercises. Nobody knows how many American soldiers are stationed in Zamboanga. Even the deputy head of the Western Mindanao Command, West Minco, does not know. Although there are unconfirmed estimates that the number is about 150 in Zamboanga City alone. And from Zamboanga, they are deployed elsewhere to Basilan, Bolo, Marawi, and Maguindanao. Initially, these American Special Forces undertook what are known as cultural sensitivity training seminars at West Minco. And this was handled by Philippine government officials from the DSWCB, the local government, and the Western Mindanao State University. According to these officials, the U.S. soldiers are generally confined to the camps. As a rule, they are not allowed to go out. But they do hold weekly barbecue parties. And local government officials are invited to these barbecue parties. But they do move from one camp to another. And there are 3 American camps in Zamboanga. One is in Calarian, which is the headquarters of the West Minco. One is at the Edwin Andrews Air Force Base of the Philippine Air Force. And another is in Barangay Malagutay. The forces used to be headed by a general, certain General Booster. I don't know if I get the spelling right. But today only a colonel heads the forces in Zamboanga. The U.S. soldiers are generally low-key, according to this former official. They have rare public appearances. Sometimes officers attend official government functions, like programs. Sometimes they also have special dinners at a popular beach resort, known as La Vista del Mar. Since they are not allowed to build permanent facilities, only semi-permanent structures, and their quarters consist only of container vans. There is a semi-permanent mini hangar, but the parking area for DynCorp planes and choppers is cemented. DynCorp. I asked this former official, what is DynCorp? In Zamboanga, the U.S. troops employ the services of a U.S. private contracting firm, Dyn Corporation, or DynCorp for short, who takes care of their food supplies and vehicle needs, including planes and helicopters, while they're in the Philippines. And this corporation is run by ex-U.S. military personnel. And this reminded me of similar arrangements in other conflict areas, Afghanistan, Iraq, and it had shades of the scandalous Blackwater contracting firm in Iraq, a construction company which has ties with ex-U.S. Vice President Cheney. DynCorp is a private U.S. company doing business in the country. but does not pay or is exempted from paying taxes to the Philippine government. Company officials claim that they provide something like $20,000 a month to the local economy because they hire Filipino staff to purchase their supplies locally. Some of these Filipino staff were also sent to other war-torn areas such as Iraq and Afghanistan. DynCorp thus has a global reach. Wherever there are U.S. troops, they are also there to provide their contracted services. The question is, why does the U.S. hire the services of an American company for their food needs when the services required can also be provided by a Filipino company? Well, the reply is that the Americans have certain nutritional requirements that can only be fulfilled by another American firm. Although in the beginning they tried local caterers, but this apparently did not pass their nutritional standards. In any case, they actually employ Filipino cooks. American soldiers pay for their meals in DynCorp or run cafeteria. Again, the issue is, are these business transactions reported to the city authorities? And are food and beverage taxes paid to the government? Most likely answer, no. Since they provide the vehicles to the U.S. troops, these are private vehicles. Planes, helicopters, even boats. So they don't have military markings when American soldiers use them to move around Zamboanga City and in other areas in Mindanao. With respect to public perceptions, certain benefits are appreciated by communities, such as the improvement of infrastructure, the cementing of roads in the camps. And I asked, if a survey were to be conducted, some of the residents would probably vote favorably for the detention of the U.S. troops because they allegedly feel safe with the presence of the Americans. But when one local official questioned their presence in Zamboanga, this person was criticized for anti-VFA stand, for an anti-VFA standpoint. This official then narrated certain complaints and issues with respect to the presence of U.S. troops in Zamboanga. When they first started basing themselves in Zamboanga, the vehicles used by these U.S. troops had no plate numbers. The city council filed a complaint, and the reply was that it was for security reasons that they don't use plate numbers. To which the Filipino officials replied, well, we too have security concerns as local government officials, but we use plate numbers in our vehicles. Lately, some U.S. soldiers or even personnel in DynCorp can now visit night spots such as disco bars, and there have been cases of abusive behavior in traffic accidents involving these American troops. Another issue is that Filipino prostitutes have also been seen being brought inside the camp to service the U.S. soldiers, and this was reported by the wives of Filipino generals in the camp. Some U.S. soldiers were part of so-called community relations programs to win the hearts and minds of the Zamboanga community. These are medical outreach missions, medical, dental, nursing services, visits to orphanages. But the dialogue had to be conducted with city officials because these medical outreach missions were being conducted without coordinating or informing local authorities, even though they had local partners such as the Rotary Club. Because of this dialogue, the U.S. now coordinates with city government when they go on their missions. In any case, today, these medical missions are now limited, rare, and sporadic. Perhaps because the goal of winning hearts and minds have already been achieved. I also got an additional information from a friend in Maguindanao who said that the most popular medical mission program of U.S. troops in Maguindanao is their Operation Libreng Tuli, free circumcision. Very popular, young and old alike, line up for their free circumcision because antibiotics are also provided free. Anyway, back to Zamboanga. In general, local government officials in Zamboanga complain that they know absolutely nothing about the U.S. forces' main activities, since they never bothered to dialogue with the latter on these matters. In 2008, there was a complaint to the House of Representatives Defense Committee because of an incident involving a large U.S. cargo plane that landed at the Zamboanga airport, unloading helicopters. You can just imagine how large this plane is. It can unload helicopters. Since the airport had no hangar large enough for this cargo plane, the plane was parked at the runway overnight. But it rained, and because of the weight of the plane, the asphalt in the runway gave way and was damaged. Another complaint from the city government involving the airport is that the U.S. and Dyncorp planes are exempted from paying landing fees, supposedly in accordance with VFA provisions. This was the opinion rendered by the Department of Foreign Affairs. But this deprives the local government of income and of funds for airport runway maintenance and repair. Another complaint has to do with air traffic control. U.S. planes and choppers land or take off at any time of the day and night, even when there are no air traffic controllers on duty, because these traffic controllers are off by 11 in the evening. This is due to the downgrading of the Zamboanga airport based on an order from then President Arroyo of the Regional Transfer Program. Thus, their coming and going cannot be monitored, and this causes danger to the airport facilities and the community. Although generally Zamboanga residents have no problem with the presence of U.S. troops, there are moral civil society groups that have questioned their presence. Example, the local media reported that during one military training exercise in Holo by U.S. soldiers, there was indiscriminate firing of weapons, resulting in injury to a wood gatherer. There is also an issue of used military boats. For example, there is a Mark V high-speed Navy boat, which was partly offered, this is not clear, partly offered for sale to the Philippine government for use by the Philippine Navy, but was unacceptable because of the high maintenance and operating costs. Local officials asked, what is the long-term plan of the U.S. forces? Because there seems to be no long-term plan. Hopefully, there should be no long-term plan. They say they're here to support the Philippine government's war against terror. They claim not to be involved in military operations. They just point where the enemy is and let the Philippine soldiers take care of it. Something like, "Nandiyan ang kaaway, kayo nang bahala." In 2005 or maybe 2006, there was a forum in Cotabato where a U.S. embassy official was asked why U.S. troops are in Mindanao. He said, America is here to protect its own interests. There is also a certain mystery about retired VFA personnel who returned to Zamboanga City. Retired American officers, some of them still quite young, who served in the Philippines under pre-VFA Joint Special Operations Task Force, have returned. One claimed to be in town to conduct training of Philippine Air Force personnel. Upon inquiry with the Air Base commander, the latter denied that such training is to be conducted. The American also claimed that he was marketing a certain telephone device with a special software for bugging purposes. That he was also interested in infrastructure projects of the city government. Local officials are suspicious of these characters and are wary of being closely associated with them because their motives and activities are a mystery and they apparently don't have any official accountability. Are they intelligence operatives, CIA, or Americans simply looking for business opportunities, using contacts gained during their previous VFA tour of duty? So there are certain ethical issues here. If the latter, it is simply looking for business, then the VFA becomes a vehicle for entry of American business in the country without going through legal and official procedures and relying mostly on personal contacts. So this is what economists would call a form of rent seeking. I also got ended the interview, but after the interview I came across an article in the Manila Bulletin, dated 2002 actually. Headline, U.S. troops learn Chabacano. Chabacano, of course, is the language, not dialect, mind. Zamboanga City. I come from Zamboanga City, so I should know. So, the American, according to this report, the U.S. military has contracted a firm to translate 4 pages of a document called Special Travel Project, English terms to be translated into Chabacano. for use by special forces in Basilan and Zamboanga. Okay, so most of the terms in this that are to be translated are basic terms such as what is your name, cosa tu nombre, please introduce me, favor introduce conmigo, he wants to meet you, quiere conocer contigo, are you married, kasal ba to? No, I'm still single, no, so pero kayo, can I visit? Pwede yung visita? So it's like, you know, courtship procedure. So quite harmless phrases that they want translated into Chabacano. But I also came across another document. Someone passed on to me a document, quite more recent, which also outlines instructions for translating English terms to Chabacano, which are quite disturbing. Terms like, we are coalition forces, follow our orders, stop or I'll shoot, put your weapon down, hands up, surrender, go, move to the right, move to the left. Statements also related to forces manning checkpoints, such as please step out of the vehicle, stop the vehicle, stay away from the vehicle, come with me, raise your hands. Statements also to be translated relating to the search and capture of persons, such as we must search you. Women and children in this room, please move to the personal search area. Lie down, get up, don't move. Where is the enemy camp? Do you have any ammunition? Statements also relating to curfew enforcement, such as get out of your vehicle. We have to arrest you. You are under arrest. I must inspect all possessions you have. You are a prisoner. Do not move. We are conducting this interrogation to gather military intelligence. So these are to be quite disturbing terms that U.S. troops want translated into Chabacano for their use in operations and activities in Mindanao. If they are not related to, if they are not supposed to be engaged in direct combat operations, why they want to translate it into Chabacano? Terms that are actually used in combat operations. Thank you.
So, mga bata, alam niyo mga barbecue parties at mga Chabacano, functional purposes. Speaking in behalf of the partido na manggagawa, Mr. Wilson Fortaleza.
Magandang umaga po. Sorry hindi ko nabutan yung presentation ni Congressman Erin. Gusto ko rin sana kung natuloy sana, pero hindi yata natuloy natin. Si President Era, maganda sana mag-react sa kanya kasi nung time na nagde-debate dito sa DFA, biglang nagbago ang kanyang position from very firm stand against the US bases. Bigla siyang 360 degrees na ikot dito sa DFA. Nung nagsusulat kami sa aming magazine noon, sa aming party, nagdidebate rin kami ng aming part ng editorial staff kung anong lalagay natin title. So, ang debate namin is basically, totoo ba talaga na si Era ay parang mag-shift ng kanyang position? Kasi parang hindi ba magiging kasiraan niya itong ganitong klase na anyway, itinulak naman niya talaga yung passage ng DFA. So naglabas kami ng dyaryo, ang title ng dyaryo ay Era para sa Kano. Na parang nung pinag-uusapan namin yun, baka naman parang hindi naman bagay o hindi tama na i-brand mo si President Era na tuta ng Kano, the usual language ng protesta sa laban sa mga opisyal ng gobyerno kapag nagbibigay ng favor sa mga Amerikano. Pero ang parang pinakamabigat lang talaga na ginawa ni Era, talagang nagbigay siya ng marching order sa Senate noon na pirmahan ang DFA. Kahit napaka-intense ng debate noon, parang wala namang masyadong urgency na ipasa ito. talagang nagbigay siya ng marching orders para ano. Kaya nga sana kung dumating siya dito, maganda siyang tanungin kung ano na ngayon ang pakiramdam niya. Dahil sa mga reports, talagang marami ay violated doon sa mga provisions ng BFA. Nung pinasa ang BFA ng 1998, siguro mga hindi ko gaano maalala, 2000, nag-file kami ng case agad sa Supreme Court questioning the constitutionality of BFA based on mga news accounts na, kasi before that may mga news accounts na involve ang mga US troops na sa pagpapatrol sa Mindanao, pero dininay ng Supreme Court yung aming petition at ang sabi ng Supreme Court wala pa naman daw injured, wala pang nasaktan, wala pang ano, so parang napaka premature pa yung petition namin sa Supreme Court. So siguro maganda na lang sigurong pag-usapan, parang itagdag lang siguro ngayon kasi may scheduled na US visit si Pinoy and ngayong September yan. So, wala pang date, pero prior to that may mga inisyu ng release sa website ang Malacanang na baka i-bring up ni Pinoy ang issue ng BFA pagpunta sa US. Pero walang categorical statement na i-bring up. At parang napakahirap ang paniwalaan kung parang i-analyze kung ano talaga ang parang position ng Malacanang ngayon dito. Dahil nagtayo sila ng review committee, wala namang report kung ano ang ginawang review, kung totoo bang nag-review. Pero mayroon na talaga silang hina-harbor na fear na masyadong radical ang termination. Despite may position ng Senate na Foreign Relations Committee na i-terminate na ito. And mapapansin nyo, nung bumisita rin siya sa China, nung bago siya bumisita, ang tapang-tapang ng Pilipinas, di ba? Ang tapang-tapang ni Pinoy na erase yung issue ng Spratly, sovereignty issue sa Spratly. Pero pagdating sa China, mukhang hindi rin naman yun ang naging main na agenda. At pagbalik nga niya, investment ang dala, puro minero pa, no? Puro mining, karamihan. So, tingin ko mas mahirap asahan, mas maraming asahan siguro ang the Pinoy administration to bring up this issue. Kaya dapat i-challenge siya na i-bring up kay Obama, kung mag-meet man sila ni Obama, na i-bring up itong issue ito. Pero paano niya i-bring up kung wala pa silang posisyon? Walang lumalabas na posisyon ang Malacanang ngayon kaugnay ng BFA. Nag-search din ako sa internet kung mayroon man lang parang Malacanang official in this 1 year in office ni Pinoy na nagsalita categorically na the Pinoy administration is willing or will pursue the idea of terminating this agreement. Kaya puro review, ang dami ng review, ang Senate, ang Congress, may mga investigation na, pero malamang hanggang dun lang ang pwedeng abutin na review. So kung 6 years silang magre-review, malamang safe ang position ngayon ni Pinoy. At least hindi siya nagsabi na ayaw niya sa BFA, hindi rin siya nagsabi na pro-BFA siya. Ayun ang mahirap, mas mahirap na kung ang legislative body ang parang aasahan natin, I think Miriam has done his job dito sa pag-review nito along the way habang ini-investigate nila, along the way na na-review nila ito, pero ang House wala, so may resolution ang House, pero andito naman si Congressman. Pag mas marami kasing nagdedebate, mas mahirap ang So sa Senate, ilan lang silang nagdedebate, baka mabilis matapos ang process. Pero pagdating sa Congress, ang dami at medyo mabagal ang process. Pero tingnan natin, sana through the efforts ng ating mga progressive representatives, buti na lang at mayroon naman mas marami actually tayong ganyan sa Congress kaysa sa Senate, kasi may party list tayo sa sa Congress at may mga progressive type representatives gaya nila Erin compared sa Senate. Pero mukhang bakit parang mas mabagal ang galaw sa Congress kaysa sa Senate. Kung parang by political whip, party whip, parang mas madali ngayong makagalaw sa Congress dahil nga may coalition na nag-ooperate sa Congress rather than the Senate. Kaya sana yung ating pag-push nung campaign para sa termination ng VFA ay pwede natin i-consider na magandang arena itong Congress. At least man lang mag-spark lang ulit ng debate, no? Kasi 10 years after ng termination ng US military bases, then na-revive ang usapan, issue ng sovereignty dito sa debate ng BFA. Then pagkatapos niyan, wala na. So baka nga best na magkaroon ng mga series ng mga efforts to series ng mga fora na ganito, forum na ganito, then active na engagement siguro sa legislative body kasi sila ngayon lalo lang Senate dahil ang Senate ngayon ang parang yun pa lang hindi ko pa natanong, no, yung it is not considered by the US as a treaty, no. Nandito naman si Attorney Nano kasi so it's merely an executive agreement, pero dito sa atin Senate ang kailangang mag-terminate. Pero sa US, hindi siya ganon ang treatment sa kanya. So, pwede bang, kung ganon din lang ang treatment, pwede bang executive action ay pwedeng gawin ng the PRO administration? Dahil nga, kung executive agreement din lang naman ito. So, sa akin, wala pang malinaw na sagot ngayon dyan sa tanong na yan. Anyway, hindi ako makakapag-react masyado dun sa ibang nagsalita dahil dito ko inabutan. So, pasensya na po. Good morning, maraming salamat.
Salamat, Mr. Fortaleza. We now open the floor for your questions. But first, I would like to recognize si Atty. Sarito Planas.
Higit sa lahat po ay ino-congratulate ko po ang forum na ito na pinag-usapan natin at nire-review ang Philippine-U.S. military relations. Congratulations po. Para po sa kaalaman ng ating mga kapatid na mga kabataan, meron pong US bases sa Japan at meron din US bases sa Pilipinas. Ang relasyon ng US bases sa Japan is lessor-lessee. So, taon-taon, pinag-uusapan na lang kung makano ang ibabayad sa Japan para manatili ang US bases sa Japan. Sa Pilipinas, ang relationship